Hey guys, I just wanted to take you along on some hill country e-scouting today. I just wanted to demonstrate how to do this because I've had a lot of requests for more hill country content and some more e-scouting content. And this is kind of the time of year that people are going to be picking their properties, trying to figure out where they want to hunt and how to evaluate that property on a mapping basis so that they can quickly take care of what they need to on their boots on the ground scouting. While I don't think e-scouting is 100% necessary to get on mature deer, as many people don't use mapping like this to do so, I would say it makes you much more efficient and it allows you to identify situations that work and apply them to future scenarios. For example, there were 5 different times that I encountered mature bucks this year while hunting, and countless times that I had cameras in areas that mature bucks were frequenting this year. All of them were identified e-scouting, and I was able to actually apply those to new properties that I've been scouting this spring and take those situations into account and what I've seen on maps in the past, apply that to these maps that I'm going to now, and I've had a much higher success rate when I'm going boots on the ground scouting, trying to identify great areas to hunt. So in this e-scout tutorial, I'm just going to have already selected the property, show you guys exactly how I would go about scouting it. First off, the applications I use. Obviously I use onX Hunt. You hear me talk about it all the time. I love it. I love being able to record the data I do on it and keep it all into account and use it for knowledge over time. Next, I use the Wisconsin Public Access Lands Mapping. The reason I use this is because it's the best leaf-off imagery that I have access to. A lot of people use Google Earth for this, but in many of the areas I hunt, Google Earth doesn't offer leaf-off imagery. So this is something I use, and you'll see exactly how this leaf-off imagery helps me so much, especially in the hills. And also now I'm finding in the marsh country in southeast Wisconsin as well. Lastly, I use CalTopo, CalTopo, whatever you want to call it. I love this map application. I use it specifically for its features in 10-foot contours. I use the slope angle shading a little bit, and I use the sun exposure feature a lot. Sun exposure comes very handy when performing e-scouting for in-season trips and identifying when I need to set up and where I need to set up in order to key in on those spots I've identified. I'll get to that a little more in the future, but first thing I want to do is identify access on these maps. So you can see in white here, we're just going to pretend there's a road. We're going to pretend there isn't a road here. This in white is a common thing I see, a road going to a certain border and going the entire way across a property. So what I'm going to do first is use my color coding that I like to do. I like to use aqua for access. So first, I'm going to identify parking areas. So we'll say that's a parking area right here. I like to identify it with the P symbol and put it in aqua, so I know that that is an access point. And we'll just say that there is another parking area somewhere over here. That looks about right. And we'll put that there. And I know that this road is going to be access if there's parking along it, but I just know that this areas in proximity to this are either going to be overlooked or very, very easy to get to. So right here is parking. Next, I'm going to use the Wisconsin Public Land Access Maps to identify logging roads. This is a very, very important thing when it comes to public land. So first off, I can already see on onX that I got one right here. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this as an easy route for someone to access. Now a lot of times in hill country like this, it's going to be really, really easy for people to walk these trails, and they'll be happy to walk these as long as there's a trail. And then a lot of the times, no matter how far back this goes, they can follow it, but they won't take the extra effort to go more than a half mile after that. I don't know why. It might be just because the walking is a little harder, but they don't like to do that. So I can see that there's a trail there. I'm assuming it's going to lead to the end of that opening. I use that gradient for human traffic, and I can tell, I'll zoom in a little bit here, that there's a path going through these pines here. So I'm going to update that as a trail right there, and I can even see right now that it loops along this side. And I haven't gone over this map beforehand. This is just something that I am seeing, and I can kind of see an opening here, so it's pretty safe to assume that people wouldn't really have a problem walking there either. And now that's pretty much what I can see quite obviously from this map. I could pour over it a little more and find some more places that are logging trails using OnX. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is switch to my Wisconsin DNR mapping. So already I can see a little bit of access trail coming in here. I can see what looks like a creek there. I can see access coming in through there a little bit, and certainly from there. Because I've already able to identify this one with this zoomed out perspective, I'm going to go ahead and do that on my OnX map. Now a really easy way to do this is to use screen snaps or multiple screens. So I'm going to snap that screen onto the side. I'm going to snap this screen onto this side, and that allows me to have them side by side. So what I'm going to do now, and you'll have to bear with some of the buffering here, is I'm going to zoom in, and that map is going to upload. Now that buffering can be kind of a pain in the butt where it has that white screen for a while, but what it really does is it refines the map pixels, so it actually makes it higher definition as it goes, and that's why that map loads over and over again. So I can see on my map on the left that I've got a trail running like this. You can see it ends here. And again, this doesn't have to be perfect. I'm using these as a starting point when I'm scouting, so I can come back here if I want when I have my boots on the ground and certify that these are the exact trails and use actually the tracking feature in OnX. And this is an example of something I would not be able to see in OnX. Right here I can see this logging road, actually a couple here. Alright, so now you can see just that little bit of mapping made a very, very big difference. I know what ridge points are going to be accessed consistently and pretty easily here. I have got pressure coming from all sorts of different areas in this map. One thing I might note is this whole ridge is cut off from parking, so already that's making me a little bit more confident in this ridge. So the next thing I'm going to do is identify the primary buck bedding areas, or buck bedding 1/3 elevations. To me, that means the leeward sides for the common wind. So the predominant wind in my area is going to be west and occasionally northwest later in the season, but for all intents and purposes we're going to call this a west wind predominant area. So I'm going to go ahead and go around this map and label what 1/3 elevations and leeward sides there are for predominantly west wind. So I marked all those areas that are set up for kind of a west, sometimes northwest wind. As you can see, this is along the 1/3 elevation. You can tell those 1/3 elevations are where they are because it's where the lines just a little bit past where they start to get steeper and that slope begins to pick up. As you can see in this case, clean drop off there, a little bit better spacing there. A way that you can conceptualize this a little bit better if you're not used to topo maps is CalTopo gives you a little bit better breakdown, higher, greater contours. So every 10 feet there's a line here that allows you to see these transitions a little bit better. The relief shading helps a bit, and then if you want to see some slope angle shading, it's kind of a heat map on the severity of the slope. So the darker red this is, the more aggressive of a slope it is. So it's a yellow transitioning to red slope angle, and you'll be able to see that this is in many cases a steeper slope, and it's going to happen right up here, right where that white starts to turn into a deeper green and yellow. That's kind of your 1/3 line. So if I'm going to follow it around here, it's like that. It's around here, and basically it's a transition in steepness of the ridge. So the next thing I'm going to do here is look for small knobs and potentially overlooked bedding, things that you wouldn't typically see on a topo map. I'm going to look for these areas even if I've already identified them in my OnX map. I'm going to color them in red lining, so that I can identify them as a little more interesting of a point, essentially. So right now I can already see in CalTopo I've got this little knob. It looks like there's a little bit of relief on the top, but you can tell that this is just a nice little knob point right here. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this. And something that I think is good about these knobs in particular is that a buck can monitor 360 degrees of them, easily escape down the side. I think that's kind of some of the reasons that bucks like to use these knobs. So the next thing I'm going to do is activate that slope angle shading, and that's going to give me a little bit of an insight into if there are intermediate breaks in steepness. So for instance, that's a break right there. That may be a place that they can run a little bit horizontally more than normal. Interesting spots where there's potentially flatter land like there. And I'm not finding anything as far as like a great bench in this property in particular. But what it'll look like is maybe a more severe example of this a little bit higher up, where you'll get steep, and then possibly a little bit lighter shade of green or a lighter shade of white here. That's an easy area for them to escape this knob, travel along here, and come back up, or catch those lowering thermals from some does possibly bedding on that 1/3 elevation. So after I've identified some of those small knobs, I'm going to identify areas with thicker cover. So that's going to be back off of this mapping here in CalTopo. And this is something that I like to just use Onyx for. Onyx, at least the imagery in my area, has a good job of having diverse ranges of live and dead trees. So for instance, you can see live trees here. They look like oaks, maybe maples, likely oaks in my opinion. And you can see that these trees aren't holding leaves. That kind of timing of the year is great for identifying things like poplar trees or aspens. So we got that logging trail here, but that's one example. And here's another little example of poplar or aspen groves. See if we can get something a little better. Right here, poplars right here. You can also use them to identify cedar trees or pine trees in general. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to mark this point right here. I'm going to mark that as just a point of interest, or we'll mark it as a different cover. I know that point says feeding area, but to me that's a potential, pink for potential, point of different cover. A lot of those times there are thicker cover than the typical open hardwoods in those areas, and sometimes there is lower story cover. It's conducive to a lot more dense rub sign, so it'll help me classify what age bucks are using the nearby bedding areas. It'll also help me potentially identify some doe bedding as well. So again, pretend these little shacks aren't here. I've got pines here, and these look like taller pines, look like row pines, but this is like what I'm looking for. Again, a little more sporadic, little more conducive. You can see varying heights in the pines here, but it's a little bit more conducive to different cover and potentially bedding. You want that low story cover. That can be difficult to find in hill country. So I'm going to go over here and just kind of scour this map for some more opportunities like that. So here, this is something I would really like to find, is these white tops, these poplar groves, aspen groves, whatever you want to call them, right here in areas that are on that 1/3 elevation. That in the past has been excellent for me to find as far as being conducive to bedding. So I'm going to keep marking them as pink for potential. That is about it. Sometimes you'll see things, especially in the steep hills, like cedars or just pine trees kind of growing along this. That could be a potential grove right there too. But pine trees and thick low cover growing along that 1/3 or a point have been excellent in the past for identifying areas that are ripe for mature buck bedding. So now I'm going to start breaking out the bedding markers. I'm going to start breaking out specifically areas where I think bedding is going to be. So I've got my 1/3 marked, and what I'm going to do is I'm kind of going to be looking for places that come to points. I like points a lot better than I like just a long ridge. They may bed on both, but I believe points are much more prioritized, and what I've seen in the past is they're much more prioritized. So I'm going to mark everything in pink. Pink in my mind is possible, and it signals me as something I do want to check out. So I'm going to go ahead and mark these leeward knobs, these irregular leeward points, or I should say leeward bedding that has a point on it, and I'm going to mark them as potential bedding to check out. Basically, the theory behind this leeward bedding being the predominant bedding for mature buck is that with the predominant wind being a west wind, the leeward side is on the east-facing slope. That east-facing slope is going to be extra attractive to bucks because it's where they're going to spend most of their time. Most of their time in daylight and most of their time bedded, of course, is going to be spent on those eastward-facing slopes because that's where that thermal tunnel will be. That's where they can catch those thermals from below, like in this case. Catching a thermal from below, having the predominant wind coming this way, they get that thermal tunnel kind of occurring on that 1/3 elevation. That's an extremely safe situation for a deer. And so that's why these leeward slopes are where you're typically going to see mature buck bedding. And identifying the leeward slope in particular for the predominant wind is going to be your best odds and the most frequent locations that mature bucks spend time. At least that's what I see in my area, what Dan advocates for, and many other people as well. So the next thing I'm going to do is combine a little bit of factors that I think would make it an intelligent place to bed. Now we've already got marked in white if it's leeward for the predominant wind. That's one plus. We've got marked in red if it also occurs on a knob. That's another plus. So we're just stacking those factors in our favor if it's white and red. And now lastly, I'm going to keep in mind proximity to access. So not only are they very close or very far from parking, are they easy or hard to get to, but also what are they smelling with that predominant wind? I can't emphasize enough, you got to start thinking about why big bucks are doing what they're doing. Not that the bucks are doing that reasoning, but you have to think of why this area is conducive to keeping them alive. The more times that you figure out that a big buck is doing this because it's really easy for him to stay alive, the quicker you're going to be able to look at a map and identify areas where bucks are really hard to kill. And when you come across a mature buck bed, you're going to think right away, man, this buck is impossible to kill. That is what is really, really key to getting through your head and really, really key to quickly identifying and getting on these mature bucks and their bedding areas. So I'm going to take my pink points, my possible points, and I'm going to mark them as white if they're of particular interest. To me, white is kind of a color I don't have very often, and it signals for me to go ahead and check that out. It sticks out really well on the map as well. So in this case, I've got white and red together. I've got a knob, and it's on the predominant wind leeward side. I'm going to change that to a white bedding marker. I want to check that out. On this one, this is downwind of access, so that buck is going to be able to smell when people are coming from before him, and they can't get to him unless, with that predominant wind, they are first smelt by him. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this as a white point, although it is not on a particular knob. In this case, we got white and red coming together. The access is going to naturally funnel down there. This buck is going to be able to smell access and escape easily. And he's on that predominant leeward side. We're going to go ahead and call that a high priority area to check out. Now this is pretty far from the road itself, so it's going to be a little bit difficult for someone to get to. That buck is smelling the access, so we're going to go ahead and mark that as a higher priority spot as well. For instance, this, while it is on sort of a knob and is the predominant wind being leeward here, he's really close to parking, and this isn't such a small area that I wouldn't expect people to go and check that out, so I don't think this is a super, super high priority and high likelihood spot for me to check. In this case, this buck is furthest from the access on a little knob, and that leeward wind might not be helping him smell that access, but it's looking like a pretty good spot. I'm going to leave that as pink because he's not smelling the access, but it might be a spot where a buck gets undisturbed often. This one, again, close to a road that has access, assuming it has parking on it, if people can approach him from the downwind side, so not calling that high priority. This one, same thing. But in this one, in this case, if this isn't an access area, this is the most out there kind of spot. So this is another high priority place for me. this is something I want to check out. It's far away from the access. People aren't going to likely want to go up and down these ridges to get to this buck. That's something I like. If someone's kind of cheating over and using this access trail and then coming up here from the private, then he can smell them before, so that's an even bigger plus. So notice I just prioritized some points to check out, and I'll be able to actually use these different covers to analyze what kind of rubs are in the area and what kind of buck is using these areas. That's where these markers kind of come in handy here. Something that's important to note is also bedding downwind of these thicker covers that typically I've seen in the hills be doe bedding. Anything downwind of that is used a little bit more primarily during rut, so I might see areas like this used during rut, maybe things right across from this thick cover doe bedding, any areas like this that has some kind of proximity to likely doe bedding, I will find being used a little bit more in rut. So if you are, say, doing this in season for a hunt coming up, you're going to want to, and you can't go out and check out all these areas, boots on the ground scouting afterward without busting them out. You might want to label some of these areas, and then if you find all things equal, and this area also happens to be downwind of something that may be doe bedding, you might want to prioritize hunting that during the rut if it's your first approach. I'm going to be identifying areas of interest. So these are things like thermal hubs, congregation points, survey points, pinches, stuff like that. So an area of interest to me is the thermal hub first and foremost in the hills. So this is a very, very obvious thermal hub in my opinion. So what I like to do is I like to mark my thermal hubs with the junction spot and white. If this is any time in mid-October or later, I expect there to be a scrape down there and active. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this other one here, right here. And scrapes down in thermal hubs can be excellent places to monitor what bucks are in the area. Say this is a new property. I want to figure out what bucks are using those areas. And thermal hubs are an excellent way to do that. You also establish a travel direction to and from bedding a lot of the times with pictures that you'll get of mature bucks in thermal hubs. My perspective on thermal hubs is that they're areas that bucks will go to after dropping off of points, and I find an increase in activity on these thermal hubs, especially during the pre-rut and rut. A lot of the times what they'll do is, say there's a buck bedding up on this point, he'll drop down to this hub, check this scrape, see what was on it all day, and he'll actually watch from his bed that scrape the entire day. He'll be able to then use this trail down here or use this route to catch the lowering thermals of all does and other deer bedded up on these ridges. That will allow him to keep tabs on does and cover as much area as possible, as quickly as possible, and as effectively as possible by bouncing between these hub scrapes. So a lot of the times that's how bucks will first get onto the first does coming into heat. So thermal hubs, great area to monitor. Other things I might want to look at as far as setting trail cameras and such are going to be pinch points. So a pinch point might look like a saddle or a place that a ridge comes to a sharp apex. So you can tell that right here we've got a drainage coming up here, we've got a little drainage here, and this ridge is kind of narrow. So this might be a place that there's a trail up here, or maybe a trail along this 1/3, that it might be a good place for me to monitor what bucks are coming in and out of that bedding, when they're doing it, what time of year they're using it. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that in my white again so it sticks out. I'm going to use pinch point as well for that. And then obviously you can do any congregation points. So an example of this is often food sources. So in other words, I care about this ridge a little bit more because it's far from the access. This lowest corner of the field might be here, might be there. But this corner of the field coming off of the bedding is something I want to keep an eye on. So I'm actually going to mark this as a scrape because I'm assuming that there's probably going to be a scrape somewhere around there. I'm going to mark it in white, so I know that's unconfirmed. I need to go check that out. But those are how I'm going to mark my additional points of interest, things that aren't bedding, but I do definitely want to keep an eye on and use them to qualify some of the bedding for maturity and frequency. The last thing I'm going to do is switch back over to CalTopo, and I'm going to show you what I do when I am in season and I need to keep tabs on these areas and decide how I'm going to go in now and hunt it. So let's say all that e-scouting I just did was all in season. So everything I've been doing up to this point is I can't now go and confirm with boots on the ground unless it's too late if it's bedding or not. So if this was spring scouting, I will now go out and identify that bedding, confirm my stuff, delete the points that aren't accurate, and update the points with details and specific locations of the ones that are accurate, and anything I kind of find along the way. But what I'm going to do here is actually use the sun exposure feature if this was in season. So let's say this is October, and I want to find how I'm going to go in here for a PM sit. So let's say that the point I really want to hunt is this knob right here. This was one of those areas that was downwind of thick cover right here, potential doe bedding right here. It's got a unique knob right here, and I want to identify when those thermals begin to drop. So it looks like I might be in luck here, because you can see with this shade right here at 2:30 and 3 p.m. there's already shade below this point. So the buck is up here, he's not going to be having a rising thermal from particular sunlight, and he's going to probably want to drop down to this hub scrape that's down here to start checking for does. So I do want to set up below this buck, and I'm going to see what time I should probably come in. So let's say 4:30 p.m. in October. I'm already getting a dropping thermal here. So right around 4 p.m. you're probably going to find me at the bottom of this ridge working my way up. That means that sun is over on this side, and you can see the sun is coming from this side of your screen. Right here is shaded, right here is shaded, right here is shaded. So now I'm going to go to 5 p.m. and see what it looks like. So all of this ridge is now in shade right here. Everything you see right here is in shade. So now 5 p.m., that buck up here on that 1/3 on this little knob outcropping is already going to be starting to sense that dropping thermal is arriving. This area of the ridge is going to be darker than everywhere else. So that buck might start dropping down already. So I know that I want to be set somewhere by 4:30 when that shade is still at the bottom of this ridge here, and that buck is starting to think maybe it's time I get up and move. Now I'm going to go ahead and go to 6 o'clock and see what that shows. So you're going to see 6 o'clock here in October. I'm starting to get shade pretty much everywhere. So it's starting to turn to real night here besides the tops of those ridges. That's when that buck is probably going to be on his way down to the bottom, working his way down. So now I know that with that sun exposure, I'm going to want to be set before 5 p.m., but I don't want to be on that ridge any earlier than I have to be. Say 2:30. 2:30 is probably when I'm going to get to the base of that ridge, and I'm going to start working my way up to get set. And I'm probably going to set a little bit below where that buck is bedding up here, and I'm going to let that buck work down to me. I'm going to access from that downwind side, and I know so right around 5:30 that buck is going to start working his way down. So I definitely need to be set by 5:30, but if I go any bit earlier than what I said before for initially working up this ridge, that I'm probably going to be potentially getting busted by that rising thermal, because that heat is still warming up those hills, still sitting on that hill. Another thing you want to keep track of is what time of year it is. So let's say that's October. Let's go down to December now. By now everything's dark then. But you also want to use this for late season. The predominant wind is probably going to be coming more of northwest here. A little bit more version of north because that's bringing in the cold weather. But also keep in mind the sun exposure as what's going to be warmer for those deer at this time of year. So a lot of the times I find them sticking to things like pines on high wind days because that knocks down that wind, keeps them a little bit warmer during the day. And if you can get pines on a south-facing slope and you get that north wind where that's also the leeward side, you've got an excellent trifecta. So when you're marking that cover, you identify pines. 1, that's kicking down wind. It's providing them lower cover for bedding. 2, and 3, it's on a slope that sun exposure is allowing them to stay warm. So there may be pines up here. They're sitting on the edge of those pines. They're getting that wind knocked down a little bit. They can still smell what's coming from this axis. They're still getting the sunlight they need. And they're keeping that warmth as long as possible. So everything kind of factors in the case of late season where that warmth via the sun is going to make a big difference. It's going to help you pinpoint where these deer want to be bedding because, obviously they would like to be warmer. And keep in mind that that south-facing slopes, those south-facing slopes, particularly southeast, are going to be a lot of the time good on those north winds that are bringing in that cold weather for leeward side action. And they're also going to be benefiting from that sun exposure and additional heat. So keep all that stuff in mind. It's kind of a brief overview, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch back to my Onyx, and I'm going to kind of plan a route in here. This is what I'm going to do is, where am I going to park? I'm going to choose a route that is going to get me in a loop back to where I want to be. In this case, we got a good size amount of stuff to work with, so I'm probably going to park here one day, park here another day, and I'm going to make a loop. This is going to be some sucky walking, but you kind of got to just deal with it. And I'm going to walk that 1/3 so I can pick up on additional buck sign as I go. And I'm going to loop around these points, touching all that I want to see. And I'm going to loop back up and around and probably end right back here and walk that access trail back. So kind of plan out a route that you want to go. Split it into a couple days if you have to, but take your time. Use these points to get you near where you want to be, but use your mind and what you see while your boots are on the ground to get you there and know the specific spot. So my next step is I'm going to go in here. I'm going to assess everything I can, and I'm going to identify those beds. I'm going to sit in those beds, see what the deer can see, smell what it smells, if I could. I understand what it's smelling, understand what it's listening to, and how close I can get to this bed in the direction that it's exiting, why that deer is bedding there for the time of year. Maybe it's does, maybe it's a certain food source, stuff like that. I'm going to gather all the information I can in that boots on the ground scouting, and then I'm going to eliminate these points if they're not good. I'm going to add some details to them and adjust the positions if they are good.
One thing I want to add to this breakdown is a little tip if you're new to hill country. Something that may help you conceptualize topo maps a little bit better is if you go on the Onyx app and you right click and drag, you'll bring up a 3D view. Now these aren't super aggressive hills, so what you can do is click this down here and go to the 3D elevation exaggeration. So it's going to exaggerate those points, make things look a little severe, and now look, you can see that these points are actually on the 1/3. There where that ridge starts to drop down, and sometimes it's just after it drops down and gets really steep. So everything that you saw just get drawn in 2D is exactly kind of where I expect these bucks to be bedding when looking at it in 3D. You know, some of the points may be a little bit low, but again, that's the map to get you near, mine to get you there kind of principle. You can see how these thermal hubs are all areas where multiple points drop down into it. One last feature that you guys might want to know about is the waypoint radius feature. I like to use this as well. Let's just say, let's apply this to 0.1 miles. You can do that and just see kind of where people are reaching. If you want to do anything, I believe it's up to at least a mile from that parking lot, you can certainly do that. That'll help you find distance from certain spots. Another thing I like to do is sometimes I like to find the ends of logging trails, particularly those coming from access, and I like to throw a little waypoint radius on those because I generally find that people are reaching about a 1/4 mile to a 1/2 mile from the ends of those or from certain points in those. So obviously this is a very small scale map where I'm just using it to do a breakdown for you guys, but let's say it usually looks something like, I don't know, 50 yards in this case. That's usually the proportion that it is, the distance from it, because these are usually several mile long trails rather than short distances. So this is what it may look like. You can kind of see where people are very willing to go based on that, and that's what makes some of these points over here so attractive.
Thank you guys for watching. I know this is not necessarily a video that shows a lot of cool stuff in action, but it's something that I have received a lot of positive feedback on, where it was very beneficial to hunters that took the time to listen to it. So thank you guys so much for that feedback and support, and I look forward to bringing you some more stuff in the future.